Welcome to the Legal Issues for State Coalition Directors webinar. My name is Marty Shields, and I am one of the attorney advisors here at OVW. So first, I want to talk about the source of your funding. This is always one of the first things to think about when you're asking a question about, for example, is something allowable? So if you are getting state coalitions funding, there's two different possible funding sources. If you are a domestic violence coalition, you will only get set aside funds from the STOP program. If you are a sexual assault coalition or a dual coalition, you will also get funds from the Sexual Assault Services Program, or SAS funding. You might also be a pass-through for STOP or SAS formula grants. In other words, the state formula administrator lets you help with the administration of those formula grants. And you may receive subawards under either of those formula programs, and you might receive discretionary funding from OVW, such as rural funding or transitional housing. The source of the funding impacts what activities are allowable, and in some cases also activities or certifications that are required. As I mentioned, for sexual assault and dual coalitions, you are getting set aside funds from both STOP and SAS. The funds have different purpose areas, which are laid out in the annual NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, and the SAS funds specifically must be used for sexual assault activities only. Coalitions must track each source of funding separately. So these are the purpose areas for the STOP set-aside funds. 1, coordinating state victim services activities, and 2, collaborating and coordinating with federal, state, and local entities engaged in violence against women activities. Remember, if you are a dual coalition, you will need to spend equal amounts for domestic violence and sexual assault out of this STOP set-aside funding, and you will need to be able to track this. These next two slides provide some examples of allowable activities under the STOP set-aside because those purpose areas are so broad. So things like providing training and technical assistance to victim service providers, expanding technological capacity of the victim service providers, developing standards of services for victims in your state, conducting meetings or trainings for victim advocates, legal service providers, criminal justice system entities, etc. More examples: bringing local programs together to talk about gaps in services and coordinate activities to address those gaps, engaging in activities to promote coalition building, and coordinating at the federal, state, and territory level with courts, law enforcement, prosecutors, and so forth to improve response to domestic and sexual violence. So the next two slides provide the Sexual Assault Services Program purpose areas. And so this is the additional set-aside funding that sexual assault and dual coalitions get specifically to address sexual assault. And you'll see this program, or this set-aside funding, has more detailed purpose areas. So they are working with local sexual assault programs and other victim service providers to encourage appropriate responses to sexual assault, working with judicial and law enforcement agencies to encourage appropriate responses to sexual assault, working with courts, child protective services, and children's advocates to develop appropriate responses to child custody and visitation when sexual assault is a factor, designing and conducting public education campaigns planning and monitoring the distribution of grants and grant funds to the state or territory, and collaborating with and informing state, local, or federal public officials and agencies to develop and implement policies to reduce or eliminate sexual assault. And I'm going to just note here that there are some key differences between what you can do with the SASP funding and what you can do with the STOP set aside funding. And as we continue with the presentation, I'm going to highlight some specific key differences. So again, the purpose areas matter because the funds need to be used for specific projects within the appropriate purpose areas. These are not funds for the general operation of your coalition. And your application each year will need to outline, we're doing this conference or this training or this meeting or this activity that's specifically within the correct set of purpose areas. So now I'm going to begin to talk about some of the key differences. So prevention is one of those key differences. The STOP set aside funds cannot be used for prevention or for public education. The SASP set aside funds can be used for such purposes, but it needs to be sexual assault focused. Outreach about specific services available in the state may be allowable. For example, and this is now, I'm talking about both sets of funds. You can do this with the STOP set of funding as part of helping to coordinate state victim service activities, which, as you may recall, is one of the purpose areas. Your coalition could conduct outreach about what are the services available in the state. Here's all of the hotlines and the regions they serve and the services that they offer, things of that nature. So I wanted to note that all of your awards have this award condition relating to prevention activities in reference to the funding provided under 34 U.S. Code 10441C, which is the STOP funding. The recipient agrees not to produce publications, including brochures, advertisements, and internet broadcasts related to the prevention of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and/or stalking, and agrees not to facilitate trainings or presentations related to the prevention of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and/or stalking. Recipients may use grant funds to support outreach, including developing materials regarding services for victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and/or stalking. Public education efforts related to sexual assault only are permissible with funding provided under 34 USC 12511D, which is the SASP state coalition funding. Next, I want to talk to you about pass-through activities. The SASP funding can be used for planning and monitoring distribution of subgrants. So you might be able to use your SASP funding to help your state determine how to distribute subgrants. The STOP set-aside funds may not be used for this purpose. Also, the STOP and SASP formula programs each have limits on how much funding can be used for administration of those formula grants. This includes things like hosting the peer review or monitoring the subrecipients. The STOP program caps the administrative costs at 10%, and the SASP caps it at 5%. If you are acting as a pass-through, meaning that you are helping the state carry out the formula program. So, for example, you might be helping to host the peer review, make the subgrantee selections, monitor the subrecipients. In that situation, you will need to share those allocated administrative funds, the 5 or 10%. We recommend that you have a written agreement in that case that spells out the roles of each entity, the coalition and the state. For example, who is doing the monitoring? How will the state be monitoring to ensure compliance with the statute? And then also that agreement should address the share of administrative funds. How much will the state keep and how much will the coalition have? Also, some additional differences. The SASP funding addresses sexual assault across the lifespan. The STOP funding does not. STOP only addresses victims age 11 or older. And this is true for the coalition funds that are set aside out of each of these funding streams, as well as for the formula grants themselves. For STOP, just an additional note, states sometimes work with the coalition as a pass-through entity for the victim services allocation specifically. This can be challenging for the set aside within victim services of 10% for culturally specific community-based organizations, because the coalition may not be connected with all of the eligible organizations within the state. The next several slides are talking about lobbying and what you can and cannot do with each of the funding streams relating to lobbying, because this is another one of those areas where the two funding streams are different. So for the SASP funding only, which means only sexual assault or dual coalitions and only addressing sexual assault, the coalition can collaborate with and provide information to federal, state, local, and territorial public officials and agencies to develop and implement policies to reduce or eliminate sexual assault. Note that it refers to policies only and not legislation. This is a limited exception to interactions that are otherwise prohibited by statute. Collaboration and a mutual willingness to cooperate also is required. For both of the funding streams, you can identify state and model laws that embody best practices and educate policymakers about challenges faced by the victim service providers in the state. For example, you could talk about difficulties in locating transitional housing for victims, but you cannot specifically request that the state allocate funding for transitional housing. Here are some additional things that you cannot do under either funding stream without violating anti-lobbying laws. You cannot address the merits of specific legislation. You cannot advocate for specific legislative changes at the state, tribal, or federal level. And you cannot encourage grassroots lobbying for legislative change. It does not matter if there's a specific piece of legislation pending before the legislature. You still cannot do these activities. Just a note, you can lobby with non-federal funds, but you must keep detailed records if non-federal funds are to be used for lobbying. And if you have a question about whether something is okay or not okay, always ask your grant manager. And I'm going to pause right now for interpreter switch. Great. And I will start back up now. Just a note, some of the other program statutes have different purpose areas. So pay attention to the specific purpose areas of the program you're funded under. And again, ask your grant manager when in doubt. There we go. So here are some examples of potential lobbying activities by state coalitions. So first, the executive director has been invited by a state Senate committee to testify about coercive control and domestic violence. This one might be allowable depending on the specific details, because it might be an issue of, I'm just giving general information about coercive control, right? There's no specific legislation, things like that. I'd feel more comfortable if this was a sexual assault example because of the purpose area specifically for the SASC funding. But even for domestic violence, depending on the facts, if it's just very generically talking about this is what coercive control is, it might be allowable. The second one, the coalition posts a banner on the website urging readers to contact their state representative to oppose a specific bill, the Father's Bill of Rights. That one is not allowable with either funding. Next example, the coalition develops a PowerPoint for their members describing violence against women legislation considered during the past session of the state legislature. This one is not allowable as described because they're talking about potentially pending legislation. If, on the other hand, the PowerPoint was, here's new legislation that passed that might affect your services, that would be allowable as a manner of coordinating victim services. And then last, the coalition wants to host a Denim Day Awareness Month event on the steps of the state capitol. And this one also is probably not allowable. It is probably lobbying, but again, always talk to your grant manager when in doubt. Some of the lobbying prohibitions have criminal penalties, not just like civil fines. So it's important, if you're doing anything that could potentially cross the line into lobbying, to always ask your grant manager first. And another note, make sure that people like your executive director are not 100% funded on the grant, so that if your director wants to give testimony specifically about the Father's Bill of Rights, they can do that in their non-federally funded time. So next, I'm going to talk about fundraising. Fundraising is also not allowable with federal funds. And this is another reason to not have your executive director be 100% on federal grants. So that way they can use their non-federally funded time for things like fundraising. Also, think carefully about your webpage and how it is funded. For example, an OVW funded product should not include a donate here button. Also note that any funds raised through your OVW grant, for example, if your OVW grant pays for the cost of an event and then you sell t-shirts at the event, any funds raised might be treated as program income. And this means that your award amount would be reduced by the amount of the program income unless you receive prior permission. And even if you do receive prior permission, the funds would have to be used for the specific project. Staff salaries. Remember again that these funds are for projects, not for your overall operations. So consider the staffing needs of the particular project. For example, how much time do you really need from your director? Or is their role more one of supervising the project, and maybe you have a coordinator or someone like that that's full-time doing the day-to-day work on the project? Also, things like administrative staff or accountants, how much time do they need specific to the project? And then keep in mind that you can negotiate an indirect cost rate to cover overhead type expenses, or there is a 15% de minimis rate that you are allowed to include in your budget without negotiation. Next, I'm going to talk about deliverables. Any deliverables must be within the purpose areas and must be submitted to your OVW grant manager. All OVW grants have an award condition requiring the recipient to submit any materials or publications, including audiovisual or other formats, not less than 20 days prior to distribution if the deliverable is funded with the grant. If the materials are found to be outside the scope of the program or compromise victim safety, the recipient will need to revise the materials to address the concerns, or they will not be allowed to use award funds to support development or distribution of materials. So, for example, if a coalition submits to us a product that is advocating for enactment of a specific bill pending before your state legislature, so really clearly lobbying, therefore not allowable, out of scope, we're going to say you can't do that product, and there's a chance you're going to have to pay back the funds used to develop it. So again, if you have a product you're not sure about, talk to your grant manager and make sure you submit your publications and products before 20 days of release. And here are just some examples of the types of deliverables, but this is not a complete list. So maybe a newsletter to members, a flyer for an Awareness Month event. But remember, awareness is only allowable with the SASP funding stream. Agenda and slides for training, a project website, training standards for your advocates, even a podcast you would need to send for review. So here's some examples of audiences for your state coalition activities. Victim service providers, other organizations that serve victims, such as faith-based organizations or housing providers or culturally specific organizations, law enforcement, prosecutors, courts. And then for the sexual assault and dual coalitions only, also public is an allowable audience. But just a note, survivors are generally not an allowable audience under either funding source. Next, I'm going to talk about attendance at trainings, meetings, or conferences, both for presenting at such meetings or conferences and for just attending them. So first, the training, meeting, conference, etc., needs to fit within the purpose areas of your funding. So for example, a domestic violence coalition would probably not be allowed to use funding to attend a sexual assault only conference, particularly a child sexual abuse focused conference. Another example, attending a meeting with victim service providers to discuss standards of service provision. Presenting at a statewide conference on domestic or sexual violence. Having a booth at a conference for law enforcement to announce law enforcement training that is specifically provided under the award. What is not allowed is attending a meeting or training, etc., that is outside the scope of the funding source. Here's some additional unallowable activities. Human trafficking, either sex or labor trafficking, are not within the purpose areas for either funding stream. So if you're going to address trafficking, it needs to address specifically the intersection between trafficking and domestic and or sexual violence. And similarly, for missing or murdered Indigenous people, which is often abbreviated as MMIP, often MMIP is very related to domestic and sexual violence, but not in every case. And so you need to, again, be focusing on the intersection of our specific crimes, domestic and sexual violence, depending on the type of coalition, and MMIP. And then last, coalition funds cannot be used for batters intervention programs, either for the operation of such programs or for things like certification and monitoring of the programs. So although you might use your funds for things like certification monitoring of victim service providers in your state, you cannot do the same for batter intervention. And that is the end of my presentation. If you have questions on anything, feel free to email your grant manager and they will make sure to obtain an answer for you. Thank you.